A state program. State programs and state interventions pervert the feedback mechanisms that exist on the free market. Of the two, interventions are far more damaging than state programs. If a king taxed his subjects at 10% in terms of resources or money or whatever, just 10% of value, and spent that money on crap, but beyond that let his subjects be, his subjects would still have 90% functionality in their productive life. That is, things would be produced with 90% of people's resources according to what people were willing to buy with the remaining 90% of their resources. And the first things if this tax were enacted de novo would typically be luxury goods. Think Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In hard times, people sell their jewelry for food, not food for jewelry. So the 90% economy wouldn't just have less value floating around, but production would be structured differently. And this is why third world countries don't have really tiny cars and really tiny houses with each person eating really tiny, McDonald's meals. No, they have no cars, shacks for shelters, rags for clothes, and really plain food with little meat that typically needs to be heavily spiced to prevent a gag reflex, but it's all big enough that they can sustain themselves. Right? It's not like little tiny versions of what we have. Production is structured differently. A state program is similar to the king's tax. Resources are siphoned off from the population and some worthless program is created. And worthless may be hyperbolic, but it is by definition worth less than what those resources would have been used for had they not been taxed away. And we know this because those resources were not spent on it in the free market, right? That's why it had to be a state program. That's the whole point of a state program, is to spend resources in a way that people aren't spending it themselves. Examples of state programs are state education camps, or euphemistically called public schools, or transfer payments to certain people, sometimes poor people, but not always poor people. These things do pervert the structure of production to some extent, but their main cost is the direct taxation. Okay? And the direct taxation includes the 12 years in the education camps. A state program of any type is disconnected from the demands of the emergent order to some extent. It's like an organ that doesn't fully feel pain, or a company that doesn't totally suffer from its misallocation of resources, right? That doesn't take losses. And because if the state education camps had to rely on voluntary enrollment and payment of tuition, ignoring the destitute for now, they would not receive enough funds to sustain their operations. That is, they would be sensitized to the fact that they're wasting a titanic amount of resources. That is, that these public schools are really nothing more than paper jackhammers. Now, I know that if all state education camps were privatized and all legal standards requiring an appropriate education were removed, there would still be a lot of people voluntarily paying to send their kids to the same formerly state education camps than if those camps had never existed in the first place, right? Because they have habits of doing that, and so habits develop and they're not broken precipitously. The reason state programs are not totally dysfunctional is because they're not totally unregulated by demand. There are ways to pester and harass the education camps to get them to conform to the demands of the people, or in this case, parents. And if the state is based on the fantasy that voting equals the law, a politician may cite the dysfunction of the camps as a reason to vote for him instead of the incumbent to reform the camps. Now, I'm not endorsing democracy or votingism or mob absolutism, as I like to call it, but there is some feedback. That is, the education camps are not completely desensitized to the values of the people around them, but they must be desensitized enough in order to exist in the first place. However, the resource misallocation is occurring, and the desensitization allows for much more misallocation in the same way desensitization to heat allows a person to keep pressing his hand on a hot stove. And if someone is subsidized 50%, they may be able to break even selling paper jackhammers. And that's what's happening with these public schools. But as bad as state programs proper are, they're not nearly as awful as state interventions. State programs, while always having some negative interventionist impact on the economy, are predominantly just taxing. It's just taking resources away from someone and then spending it on crap that people, by their own values, generally don't want. Okay, and that's bad, but that's not the end of the world. Interventions, on the other hand, can destroy the market itself. And what's worse is that the effects of interventions tend to be blamed on the free market, which becomes non-existent because of all of the interventions. And interventions are harder to spot.